Old School Lane Casual Chats is brought to you by oldschoollane.blogspot.com and is associated with Channel Frederator, Manic Expression, The Comic Book Cast, and The Mehta Show. Hello everyone, welcome to a brand new episode of Casual Chats. I am Patricia, and I am back with Chris, aka RowdyC. Welcome back, Chris.
Well, great to be back here once again.
So, last time, we actually talked about the Disney Renaissance era. This time around, we're actually going to be talking about the Disney Golden Era. As mentioned before, for those who didn't tune into our last podcast, basically Disney fans have divided each and every single movie into 7 different eras. And the last time we talked about the Renaissance era, and this time around we're going to be discussing about the Golden Era, which is ranging from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, Dumbo, Fantasia, and Bambi. So, Rowdy, what are your thoughts about the golden era of Disney movies?
Well, I like to think that, for the most part, the golden era is probably where a lot of people were first introduced to Disney, for the most part. I mean, I grew up really when Disney was really starting to branch out in things like movies and movies, especially with television. The Disney Channel, I think, just started up really in my early years. But I almost want to say one of my family was probably one of the first to actually subscribe to the Disney Channel when it was premium on cable television. And that's why I think a lot of us first got some introduction to some of those movies. Also, we were probably among the last generations to see those movies in theaters when they were frequently re-released to the cinema. A number of those were. In fact, I almost want to say just about every one of these Golden Age films I did get to see in theaters at least once in my early years. So I like to think, I think it is pretty much like, but maybe some other movies that have been released since that were much more on a much grander stage, maybe had better writing, more developed characters, but I would say those first 5 movies especially have come to basically be looked upon as pretty much, I'm struggling to find the correct word to say here, but almost the representation of Walt Disney Pictures for the most part, which is really astounding when you remember that a number of those movies, they didn't do as well as some people might want to think in their original theatrical run.
Yeah, definitely. I think that for the most part, for a lot of these movies, they were really expensive to make. But, sure, we had some movies like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs that won the Academy. But then movies such as Pinocchio and Fantasia didn't do so well in the box office. And since then, they have pretty much been reevaluated and are looked upon as classics.
There were a number of different factors. Of course, also have to remember that kind of maybe have negatively affected a number of those movies. One of the biggest factors is that everything of those 5 released after the original Snow White took place during World War II, when Disney lost the European audience for the most part. That took a major hit to the company's revenue streams and probably did negatively affect the company's finances for quite a few years after the war finally ended.
Yeah, I would say like around the 50s was when Disney really started to get back on track. I'm sure that maybe sometime in the future we'll discuss about the World War II era Disney movies, where they were essentially trying to capture the essence of Fantasia while not exactly getting as strong of sales as Fantasia. If you guys read, they try to be like Fantasia by having a whole bunch of shorts, or maybe just having like 2 shorts. But yeah, I would say like maybe when Cinderella came out, that was when Disney was back on the map.
Yeah, absolutely. For the most part, Cinderella was the thing that got Disney back into the success rate, and we'll probably have time to talk about those films at a later date as well, as when it was in the 50s that Disney was able to move into another direction.
Yeah, that's what I believe they call the Silver Era, or the Silver Age, not to be confused with the comic book age, but it kind of similar. That was like around from the 50s leading up to Walt Disney's death around the late 60s with the Jungle Book.
Exactly.
So, yeah, today we're going to be discussing about the Golden Era. So, the first movie we're going to be discussing about is Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And the reason I am talking about this is because as of the time that I'm going to be releasing this, December 21st, 1937 was the release date of Snow White at the Carthay Circle Theater, which is where they first premiered it. Although when it did debut on theaters, it was February 4th, 1938. So essentially, Snow White will be celebrating its 80th anniversary.
I think even nowadays, it's really hard to fathom just how much of a groundbreaking film for the entire cinematic industry that this movie really was. This wasn't just Walt Disney Pictures' first full-length animated feature. This was the first full-length animated feature film that anyone had ever produced.
Yes. So, I mean, it is true that animated featurettes have been around, whether it be from Disney or the Fleischer Brothers, or to some smaller extent, Warner Brothers when they were doing the Merry Melodies, but you have to understand that Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs was like a grander scale. Like, this was when Disney was pushing their animation to new levels. They were releasing something that was at least over an hour long, as opposed to being something like maybe 5 to 8 minutes. So this was like incredibly groundbreaking, and yeah, it's based off of the fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm, and I'm sure that a lot of people who listen to this podcast, they already know what the story's about, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But what I want to talk about is that looking back on the original Snow White movie, I can recall about how amazing the art style is and how fluid the animation was.
Yeah, it's really, even from the very beginning, this was probably the first example that shows you just how much, not just Walt himself, but really the Disney production company as a whole has always tried to be groundbreaking, especially in the technical aspects of animation. It pretty much started with this film as it is. I remember watching, I think it was back in the 50th, when it reached its 50th anniversary, I believe it was, in the mid-'80s. They had this television special that aired that was hosted by Dick Van Dyke, of all people, and they were talking about the production of making this movie and how they went so far as to a lot of scenes were shot using not smaller cells. They went with incredibly huge glass sheets, but painted with the animation painted on it to try to do a much more grander scale. In fact, I still believe that to this day, when I first saw Beauty and the Beast, which was their 30th animated feature, I looked at that opening shot of the forest zooming in on the Beast's castle, and I still to this day could swear that just for at least that one scene in some kind of tribute, they might have actually used that same type of glass paneling set for that, at least that one shot in the movie, because it looked so much like it could have been the same thing.
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely see that, kind of like a tribute to what came out before. And also, you know, speaking of that opening sequence, if you see the deer near the brook, that's actually Bambi's mom in the background.
They've always loved to have those type of Easter eggs in their films, especially in the later times. Of course, there was also a lot more groundbreaking things. I think to this day, this is still the only rendition, or if it wasn't the only one, it definitely was the first rendition of this story that actually gave the dwarves names. There had no other of the original, not even the original story had specific names or personalities to those characters. So that's kind of more a groundbreaking thing of how Disney really wanted to put his own imprint on this story.
Yes, absolutely. And I remember there was a book. I don't think it was a book about Snow White per se, but I think it was a book discussing about the early animations of Disney, like leading up to the original shorts, leading up to I want to say The Rescuers. I think that was the last tidbit, because that was the newest book, the newest movie at the time. And I remember that when they got to the chapter of Snow White, there were like a whole bunch of names that were scrapped that they wanted to name the dwarves, but for some reason,
I think there was briefly also mentioned in that television special that I watched on the movie's anniversary as well. I don't remember many of them, especially because Van Dyke just read off of them incredibly quickly as some kind of gag that he was reading them off of a teleprompter cue card and stuff. But yeah, I do remember they had a lot of different scenes. He also talks about how there was scenes that were cut out from the original movie, like the scene of the dwarves actually eating. That explains how Dopey got the soap out of him that he swallows in the bathing scene, in the hand washing scene earlier. There was a number of different, all that type of things in all these little tidbits of what went into the production.
Yeah, I think I do have a list of some of the names that I can recall. Some of the names included Shorty, Wheezy, Lazy. Let's see what else we got. Jumpy, Dizzy, Hickey, Gabby, Nifty, Sniffy, Swift, Puffy, Stuffy, and Burpy. So yeah, there were a lot more names. But yeah, those were cut from the film.
Well, they only had to choose 7 from all of those, and just went with the best ones. What just amazes me to think about, well, not just with this film, but all of these other 5, just to get this out of the way, and even more films that were produced by Walt Disney later on up until the 50s. It's kind of amazing to realize nowadays, when we see just how much of a huge studio conglomerate Disney has become. When this film was first made and released, Walt Disney Pictures was one of the small independent studios. I mean, back then, of course, there were the big 5 studios that more or less controlled the entire film industry, and Disney had to basically work out a distribution deal with RKO Radio Pictures, which was pretty much the smallest of the big 5, in order to get this film distributed.
Yeah, and
it was a very similar format to almost what we've got right now with our bigger studios of Universal and I guess Sony is one of them again. I can't remember what all the big studios nowadays are, but I think in the past it was Columbia, Fox, RKO, Warner. One of the other ones that escapes my mind right now, but they really did have to get extra help to get the films distributed. I think up until the 50s. I'm not either. I think either Lady and the Tramp or Sleeping Beauty was the first one that Walt Disney Pictures was able to distribute themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Which, again, not too surprising, of course, because Disney was taking a big risk. It's like you're absolutely right that there was a lot of competition when it came to animation back in the day, and Disney wanted to push himself. He wanted to take a huge risk into creating a huge full-length feature production that's completely animated, which has never been done before, and a lot of other studios would pretty much follow in his footsteps since then. So and of course, because of Disney taking that huge risk, and for the longest time, there were a lot of other studios that wanted to produce something based off of a fairy tale. Like, I remember that there was like a lot of animation companies that did their own takeoff of a fairy tale, whether it be Little Red Riding Hood with Tex Avery, or even let's see, I think the Three Little Pigs already came out already, but then there's as time goes on, I think that a lot of people, it was kind of like a time in which, like, oh, Snow White, a classic fairy tale, let's see if we can do our own rendition of it. And then, of course, like even when animation became a lot more huger, they started taking that route of trying to follow the Disney formula. And of course, we have the quote unquote official sequel to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in the form of Happily Ever After from Filmation.
Yeah, I can't. Of course, and then later on, it took this a few years later, but they officially, I think, may have kind of gotten their own version where they did the official sequel to The Wizard with Return to Oz in the 80s.
Yeah, that's true, yeah. But, yeah, and even still to this day, I mean, and then, of course, I think back in, 2011 or 2012, Disney officially did a TV series based off of the Seven Dwarfs, kind of like a prequel called The 7Ds. And I've only seen a handful of episodes. It's done by the same people who did stuff like Animaniacs and Tiny Toon Adventures. And from what I've seen of it, it's actually pretty fun. It's a lot of, I think it's a pretty decent show. Anyway, so, yeah, I don't think there's really much to say about this movie. I think that the legacy itself already still... it still holds itself up. Sure, there's a lot of things that don't exactly hold up very well. Maybe, certain characters are not as developed as others, and maybe the story is not as complex, but the stuff that it does have is still really impressive. I do like the different tonal shifts that the movie has. It can be something fun and whimsical, but at the same time, it can be really scary. So, and then of course, it can be really sad when the dwarves start crying when Snow White is presumed dead. So, and then of course there's that happily ever after with the prince coming by and giving Snow White her kiss, and then they ride off into the castle. So yeah, I do think. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I do think that there are some areas with the storytelling that I think actually, especially when you think of it at its time, are far more developed than I think a lot of people give it credit for. I mean, first off, you have the fact that they gave each of the dwarves their own individual personalities, perhaps highlighted most of all by Grumpy, who you could tell is this guy who has this really very crabby, shut-in facade personality, but he really hidden beneath it really does care for not just Snow White but his other companions, and is pretty much the one guy who you could count on to take charge even in the most dangerous of situations. The other thing is that I think really doesn't give a lot of credit for is the fact that they at least, and this is something that happens in a few other films that hopefully we'll get into in later editions, but they at least establish the fact that Snow White meets the prince ahead of time and develops feelings for him very early on in the movie. So we already know that they kind of already know each other when the final scene approaches, and there's a reason he went out to find her. The way it kind of gets underappreciated that Walt thought that far ahead and thinking that let's at least try to give, even if it's very simplistic, give some type of reason as to why this prince was heading out in the forest looking for this girl, and why it would be his kiss that would wake her up. That's really, I don't think a lot of people give enough credit for that.
That's a very interesting observation. So, yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. As opposed to, some Disney movies, like Cinderella, in which she doesn't meet the prince until she goes over to the ball, but Snow White already knew the prince, and she already started to have feelings for him, and so that's why when she sang "Someday My Prince Will Come," they already had that connection, as opposed to maybe she already knew about the prince, but she's never met him before, and she hopes that he'll love her, but no, it already has a strong, and also another thing that's really interesting is that the prince didn't know that Snow White was a princess. She was dressed in rags, washing away the pathway to the castle. So he fell in love with somebody who was essentially who he thought was a servant girl. And so when they started singing towards one another, they already had that strong affection towards one another.
It's really actually interesting to point out that there is that type of irony almost in all three of what I might call the original 3 Disney princesses. The other 2 I'm sure we'll talk about at a later time, because I definitely have some interesting thoughts on those other 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure that maybe sometime in the future we will get to the other eras of Disney, but yeah, I definitely am interested in what your thoughts are on that. All right, I guess there's if you have anything else to say, then I guess we can move on to our next movie.
Absolutely.
All right, let's go over to our next movie in the lineup, which is Pinocchio, and and if you're expecting us to talk about how, this movie is nothing like the original book, we're not going to talk about that.
Now, that's why I think we got to get, I've actually been thinking about this recently, because, again, I have to tie this into more, recent events. A lot of people have talked about how, Disney's current struggles with creating stories, especially with their flagship studio, and they're tying it into the fact that they more or less shot themselves in the foot with their affecting the public domain and copyright laws, and now there's not very many stories that they can take out of public domain and adapt. I've got my own questions about that, but for what it's worth, and I talked about this, how kind of Disney did build its entire history and existence up on adapting other people's stories, but for what it's worth, to give them the most credit, they do still try to put their own spin on a lot of these stories. And it's kind of maybe because of that a lot of these, especially these Golden Age stories, some of the more classic ones that we'll get into later, why these movies have become more recognizable for the title than the original works themselves.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, there are a lot of incarnations on Pinocchio, and I'm sure that a lot of people can debate about, which one is more accurate to the book, which one gives the most, which one is the closest to the book. But if you're going to be looking up Pinocchio on Google, the Walt Disney version is going to be the first one to pop up.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I recently listened to the Animated Anarchy podcast discussing about Pinocchio, and it is really, really fascinating. If you have not, I know I promoted this podcast a billion times, and I'm sorry, but seriously, please check out their discussion about Pinocchio, because if you thought that Snow White was incredibly groundbreaking, everything that Pinocchio did was like upping the next level. They were working with they were basically just creating a whole bunch of new techniques never seen before in an animated feature. And a lot of the there was a lot of neat effects that had never been done before with Pinocchio. A lot of detail in the background, and the way that Pinocchio and Jiminy would be going underwater, or just with the movement of the puppetry compared to the movement of a human or an animal. The climactic action scene with Pinocchio, Geppetto, and trying to row away from Monstro. And also the scary scenes, especially when they go over to Pleasure Island. It's something to behold, that's for sure. It's definitely one of the more darker Disney movies.
Yeah, that might be one of the reasons why that film wasn't as successful as Snow White was, though apparently it did have some fair success in the United States domestically, but apparently the overseas crowd being affected by the war wasn't quite in the mood for it, for the most part, from what I've been able to research. So this is basically one of those first films that really became more beloved over time, to the point where it's now just, I think it only recently finally got its first Blu-ray release.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I even heard from from the Animated Anarchy podcast that some hardcore Pinocchio fans from Italy don't really like the Disney version, from what I remember. Kind of like the same thing in which when British people really do not like Disney's incarnation of Winnie the Pooh. So I can understand that, but for what it is, basically trying to adapt a really dark book into a kid's film, I think it's done really, really well. Definitely a lot better than some people even give credit for. But I don't think that's the case in which people, disregard it. But I think that a lot of people give it the respect that it deserves. It's actually a really, really fascinating movie to be, if I do say. Yeah, but you're absolutely right that this movie didn't do well in the box office. They kind of called it that it wasn't as good as Snow White. Although it did win a few Academy Awards, it didn't really gain a huge success until many years later when it was seen as an instant classic, and it was seen as culturally, historically significant.
And if anything, and you mentioned the thing about, well, of course, historically significant. The one thing that I think that might be the most lasting impression of this movie, when I look back and try to think of what are probably nowadays looked upon as probably Disney's most known symbols, there's three things that come to mind. If I almost look at the even if you look at the mascot character of Disney. First, some people might say Mickey Mouse, but actually another ones I would think of would be Tinkerbell from Peter Pan. Probably another most iconic image, of course, would be Cinderella's castle. But if you would ask what probably the number one theme song of Disney is, I almost think I would have to go with When You Wish Upon a Star.
Yes, and this is the very first time in which the whole marketing line for Disney of if you wish upon a star, your dreams will come true. This is where it came from. And it basically that's like their motto. If you ever go to a Disney theme park, it's sung practically all the time. There's lines of it are pretty much depending on where you go, it's like etched all around. It's pretty much like their main motto.
The instrumental of the song has been used in Disney's title card for at least the past 30 years or so.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, even still to this day, it's still used in their title cards.
Exactly.
And, and also another thing that Disney introduced, that a lot of animated movies and TV shows would bring about is that they introduced a sidekick for the main character. So Jiminy Cricket is just as much of an important part of the story as Pinocchio. And
absolutely. And to the fact that he's basically be another one of Disney's major mascot characters, and especially when you look how the character was reused in a lot of Disney animated specials in the years following. Probably, I guess it was around the 50s, and so we did a lot of Disney almost educational specials that Jiminy Cricket himself hosted.
Yeah, there was, what was it, Make My Music, and he was in the Mickey's Christmas Carol. Yeah, he was in a lot of stuff back then, absolutely. And every time, and when I was a kid, every time that they've written a book about Pinocchio, Jiminy is featured in practically all of them. Yeah, I think that, similar to Snow White, it brings a lot of emotion there's a lot of emotional moments in Pinocchio. You have Geppetto who's constantly, happy every time that, when he saw Pinocchio for the first time, he's extremely happy and he starts dancing around and he activates his clocks at night, probably 2:00 in the morning while everybody's sleeping. And then there's the scary moments with Stromboli or with the coachman in Pleasure Island, or Monstro, and then there's the really sad moments with Pinocchio being captured by Monstro or Pinocchio presumed dead by Monstro. But anyway, there's a lot of, I remember for some people, they were absolutely scared by this movie, that some of them didn't even want to watch it because it frightened them too much. But yet at the same time, they were fascinated by it.
It's one thing that we definitely don't think about much when it comes to Disney. Doug Walker, the nostalgia critic, did his list it suggested that Disney had some of the saddest moments in animation history as well, but also some of them are frightening when you really think about it. Again, it goes back to just how deep and in depth a lot of these animated features, especially even in the early days, they could really get for their time.
Yeah, for example, in Pleasure Island, when the kids are being turned into donkeys, you never see them go. You never see them turn back into regular people. They're being sold into salt mines and into circuses, and for the ones who could talk, we don't know what's going to happen to them. Do they get killed off? Do they get put away? It's kind of scary to think about. And then when Lampwick turns into a donkey and he just slowly transforms, and it's just incredibly frightening. And even like facial features are pretty scary as well. Like when Stromboli gets really angry, or when the coachman, his face turns red and his eyes and his mouth kind of pop out. And Monstro with its gigantic mouth when it's trying to swallow Geppetto and Pinocchio when they're getting away. There's some scary stuff, absolutely. But at the same time, this movie, similar to Snow White, also has a really nice balance between whimsical moments and sad moments that it really just pulls into your heartstrings, and then it ends on a really happy note with Jiminy helping Pinocchio turn into a real boy, and him having his little gold medal from the Blue Fairy. And yeah, I think that with what Pinocchio did, it definitely risen up to the high expectations that a lot of people felt when watching Snow White for the first time. It's a shame that it didn't really become a huge financial success, but of course it makes a lot of sense because of the war, so I'm glad that it is getting the recognition that it deserves. Anyway, so if you don't have anything else to say, then I guess we can move on to our next movie.
Very well.
All right. So the next movie, let's talk about Dumbo. And yeah.
Okay, even though that was their fourth movie.
Oh, the Fantasia. Bleh. Sorry. So let's talk about Fantasia, their third movie. And they really took a huge. I remember that. I remember seeing a documentary of Disney a few years ago, and they were discussing about how they originally were working on this Mickey Mouse cartoon about the Sorcerer's Apprentice, but then they made so many cartoons that they wanted to just put it all together in mixed with classical music, and that it was a huge, gigantic risk, but it didn't make a lot of money because, similar to Pinocchio, the movie it cost a lot to make, but it didn't make a lot because not a lot of countries could be able to see it. So it was considered.
One of the biggest problems was because the soundtrack was so very important to this film. It actually required special speakers called Fantasound to create the entire surround sound image to give the movie its full effect. And there were not a lot of theaters that had those speakers installed. So that was definitely a negative impact on this film's total experience. As well as just there had been, even back then, there was some attitude about the film being a bit too pretentious for its possible target audience.
I can definitely understand that, because I'm sure for a lot of people, maybe they kind of saw, they thought that maybe animation was supposed to be a lot more simplistic or maybe shortened to the point, but because it was building up on, oh, look at our pretty animation alongside with this classical music, they probably just think, oh, it's trying to be too important for its own good. But I mean, when you look at it now, it's essentially like art coming to life. It's like if you were to go into an art museum and then the paintings start coming to life.
And I think one of its historical impacts at least for the company is, can we at least present the possibility that The Sorcerer's Apprentice might very well be Mickey Mouse's most signature performance?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We both went to Disney World together, and if it wasn't for the fact that it was Halloween time, we could have stuck around to watch the fireworks, and one of the fireworks performance was I don't remember if they still do this one, but it was one where they had all the villains together, and Mickey as the Sorcerer's Apprentice was presenting his magic, kind of like sprinkler or fireworks coming on top, and kind of like destroying the dragon with Maleficent. So yeah, I mean, even I think that definitely out of Mickey Mouse's iconic personas, and he has a lot of them. Yeah, definitely the Sorcerer's Apprentice is still the most famous. I mean, they still have those hats on sale at the Disney store for a reason. But yeah, the Sorcerer's Apprentice is definitely a very famous one. Probably for a lot of people, it's their favorite. There's a lot of other iconic ones. There's obviously the Nutcracker with the Sugar Plum Fairy dance. There's the Rite of Spring where you have the dinosaurs. Apparently, Don Bluth was heavily inspired by that one, and eventually he would go on to do Land Before Time, and he wanted to bring up that same emotion that Rite of Spring did. And then, of course, you have... the Night on Bald Mountain is probably what many people consider to be the best one.
Well, at least I know others might consider maybe the scariest.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I'll tell you this right now because I actually got to see a re-release. It was the movie was re-released in theaters, I think, back in 1990 for its 50th anniversary. I'm actually kind of thankful of that was like the final number of the entire movie, because I pretty much left the theater in the middle during that performance because I couldn't take it. I was 11 years old. Don't judge me.
I'm not. But yeah, it was.
I actually first saw that scene in that Disney Halloween TV special, which is where it kind of first scarred me. So when I heard that scene was coming up next for the finale, yeah, I kind of went to the restroom.
Yeah. I can definitely understand why a lot of people will be scared of it. It's essentially the devil and his minions just dancing around and causing a lot of mayhem, raising the dead from their graves, and it's pretty frightening. But it does end on a really nice note with the song Ave Maria being played into the background and Chernobog not able to withstand it. So it definitely gives a nice undertone of religion without shoving it into your face, and that's what it's supposed to represent. But yeah, it was a nice way to end it, especially with I would say that Fantasia is definitely all over the place when it comes to its tonal shifts. I mean, probably not as much as Snow White or Pinocchio, but definitely the likes of Rite of Spring and Night on Bald Mountain are definitely the most they're definitely the most emotional. Everything else, I would say, is definitely either for the art or it's very light and whimsical. I want to go a little bit to an unorthodox step in direction. I know that this is technically not in part of the lineup, but I want to know about what your thoughts are for Fantasia 2000.
To be honest, I've never actually seen that movie. It's one of the very few Disney animated films I have yet to see. Obviously, there was a reason it got made, because Fantasia was the only film that Walt himself wanted to make a direct sequel to. He shelved that plans when the first one was not a box office success in its original run. So I do get that Roy E. Disney's decision to go through with that project of Fantasia 2000 was pretty much a tribute to his late uncle. So for that reason, I can understand why they would go through with a project like that. I know that it did not succeed. It's almost like its predecessor. It didn't succeed like they hoped it to. I can't really judge it myself because I haven't seen it. But at the very least, I do understand why they would undertake that project.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also did hear a few years ago that they wanted to do a third Fantasia. I think it was going to be called Fantasia 2003 or 2004 or something, but it never got off the ground. Once again, another one of many, many Disney movies that have been shelved for some reason or another. I'm sure for some people they already know about the most recent canceled movie, which was going to be a version of Jack and the Beanstalk. So
yeah, gigantic.
Yeah, gigantic. That's what it is. Yeah, I'm sure we can do an entire podcast all about canceled Disney movies, but that's for another time. But yeah, I have seen Fantasia 2000. I don't remember if that was the first Fantasia that I saw, because I did remember seeing the original when I was a kid, but that was kind of like it was kind of like in the background, but I was a familiar with its existence. So when I heard about Fantasia 2000, I was like, oh, this should be interesting. And I did watch it a lot. And then then eventually I did get a hold of Fantasia on DVD, and I watched both of them. I definitely appreciated the original a lot more because of all the risks they took and the fact that it was the first one, and it was made in 1940, and all the amazing techniques that they did with animation back in its day, and the choice of songs. I do like both of them, but yeah, I do agree that the original is hands down the best. I don't think it deserves the hate that Fantasia 2000 gets, because I know a lot of people say that it's not as it's not as grand a scale compared to the original. I think that some people don't like the intermissions with a lot of these celebrities that were featured, because it doesn't give it the same sense of class that the original presented with Stokowski introducing what the next song is going to be. I can definitely understand that, but yeah, maybe someday I'll definitely have to rewatch both of them, and maybe I can get a better understanding on what both of their strengths and weaknesses are. But yeah, I do agree what a lot of the critics and fans say. The original Fantasia is the superior version. All right. I guess if we don't have too much to say about that one, I guess we can move over to the next one. Now we can talk about. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, we're just ready to move on.
Okay. Now we can talk about Dumbo, which is the fourth one. And yeah, I remember when Dumbo. When I first saw Dumbo, I think I saw it on VHS. I mean, I didn't really think too much of it at first. I just thought it was like a really cute story with, with an elephant in the circus, and all the adventures that he had with trying to fit in, because he was pretty much ostracized with his gigantic ears, and but then I think I rewatched it again, and I rewatched it again a few years ago, and it's not one of my favorite Disney movies. I can see why some people would like it, because I do think that the story of a character who's pretty much ignored by everyone because he has gigantic ears, and he's trying to make the best out of a bad situation, and then he has his mother as his only friend, but then when she gets locked away because they thought that she was incredibly mad, they called her a mad elephant. Then he has his companion, Timothy Q. Mouse, or I guess this is basically the equivalent of Jiminy Cricket if he was a mouse, trying to help out his companion in time of need, in this case, helping Dumbo out. And basically, then, throughout the movie, he's trying to find out what he can do to, do well in the circus. And then, it's shown, like, towards the end of the movie that Dumbo could fly. So, yeah, spoilers. But, yeah, other than that, I think
this is one movie where I really, I think its message is really underappreciated, especially for its time, because now I'm not going to try to delve too much into this. I've spoken on a number of my other videos about my my dislike for a lot of people's critique of Walt Disney himself's supposed prejudices. Let's leave it at that. This movie, to me, kind of shows that whatever personal demons he may have had to deal with himself, he was, whenever possible, trying to send a message speaking out against prejudices. This was a movie about someone, who was having trouble fitting in because he was different, but ultimately found that he had he could use his differences to his advantage and be successful. And just the fact that it's shown people who ridicule others for being different as not being in a good light, and our hero having to overcome the disdain from other people to find confidence in himself. It's another one of those stories that I think really gets underrated when you really think about what this movie was really trying to say.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the fact that Dumbo doesn't really say anything, he lets his emotions do all the talking, I think is also a really strong note, because you see when he feels sad, when everybody's making fun of him for his ears, or when he becomes clumsy, when he tries to pull off a trick or a stunt during a circus performance and he's not doing very well. You can see, and the fact that his mother gets locked up away and he's like all by himself. You definitely see what Dumbo is feeling without any words, which is also really important. And when Dumbo is successful and he feels like he knows what he can be able to do to help out the circus, or just basically showcase to himself that he does have worth, is also really important as well.
Absolutely.
And I also really love the scene in which when Dumbo drops the feather thinking that that's what made him fly, and Timothy comes to him and says, you don't need that feather. You can be able to fly without the feather. And then he tries to fly and he is able to fly. I think that's also a really good lesson that for some people, maybe they have their good luck charms, or maybe they do like a little superstition or something that they think that makes them happy, or gives them good luck, but it's all about just being yourself, and you can be able to accomplish that, and you don't need to rely on cheap tricks in order for you to get the same results. So, I guess, I'm sure a lot of people in the comments are going to be talking about the pink elephant scene. So, we might as well get that part over with. Yeah, it's absolutely insane. I'll just give it that.
It's, very psychedelic, to say the least, about it. I mean, it really says something that we keep talking about. Everyone associates Disney with such kid fare, and yet there was some even in the early days, could go with some pretty wacky and almost disturbing themes in just about a lot of their movies, and that might be one of the ultimate examples.
Yeah, I'll say absolutely. So I guess another thing that I want to talk about with this movie is I have to say that I do remember a few years ago, there was like some rumors going around that they wanted to make, I think I do remember this. I think on YouTube I did remember a few years ago that there were talks about a Dumbo 2, and they were going to make a continuation of Dumbo, and they were going to introduce like some new circus friends or something. But I think it was going to be coming like around the early 2000s, but that movie was scrapped. I don't really know too much of the details of it, but I'm glad that it never happened, because that would have been a disaster. But I do remember that, hearing the news, I don't know if this is still happening, that Tim Burton is going to be doing his own version of Dumbo, which should be interesting considering of what he did to Alice in Wonderland.
And that just makes me wonder if he could make it any more freaky to watch than the Dumbo Circus TV show.
Oh, that's right. That's right. I forgot about that. That was that was one of the very first shows that I admit regularly watching in the fledgling years of the Disney Channel. In fact, probably the top three that I remember watching was Dumbo Circus, its sister show, Welcome to Pooh Corner, which was the exact same type of stop-motion puppet format, and then this
game show called Contraption that was all based around trivia involving scenes from Disney movies.
That actually sounds really interesting. I'm surprised that they haven't remade it and, talked about the more recent Disney movies. But then again, I guess we have seen it for that purpose. Oh well. But yeah, I definitely, I would say that I do like the message that Dumbo has. I'm sure that if you ever do a book on the golden era of Disney, you can dedicate an entire chapter itself on just the message. But I think that I would think that it's not as groundbreaking as Snow White or Pinocchio, but but the stuff that it does have, like the core message and some of the animation segments, I think it's still pretty important. I think that I think that maybe the stuff that it does have is really amazing, but I don't really have it as high up compared to what many people consider to be like the golden era of Disney movies. But I do still think it's pretty decent in its own right.
We gotta keep in mind that it was probably made on the lowest budget, especially of these original films, because of the financial setbacks that they'd had with Pinocchio and especially with Fantasia. It's one of the shortest, I believe, animated Disney films ever. So they had limited resources to work with, and I'd say they did probably the best job they possibly could with the limited tools they had to work for. It's still regarded as, for a lot of people, probably one of the most beloved films because of its characterizations and message.
Sure, I definitely do agree. They did the best that they could with the limitations, especially since both Pinocchio and Fantasia didn't do well financially, so I guess they didn't want to risk putting a lot of money in, or maybe they didn't have a massive budget left for doing this one. So, yeah, I do agree that it does... there are there are a lot of times in which it does showcase that that it doesn't have a gigantic budget compared to the previous movies, but you're right, it did do the best they could with what they had. Alright, I guess we can talk about the next one. The last one, actually. I know this is pretty quick. So, the last one in our list is Bambi. And... I would say, once again, similar to Pinocchio, that if you were to Google Bambi, the Disney version is going to come up first. Jaime Tude, whom we've had on the, whom we've had on the Tiny Toons, How I Spent My Summer Vacation podcast, as well as the, Fox Animation Trilogy podcast, he did, From Pages to Pictures, comparing the book of Bambi to the Disney version. And, it's completely different, obviously, because it was supposed to be an allegory about, between it was basically an allegory, comparing man to God, and the creatures are supposed to survive in the forest, and they treat man as God, and they're wondering about, should man be treated as such, or is he just like a regular creature on this earth? Very fascinating story if you look into it. But yeah, I would say that with this one, I think that since it was during the time in which, again, I think that I think Bambi came out like almost toward the middle of the war. Like it came out like during the
1942.
Okay, so yeah. So yeah, it did came out during the war, but I think that it, I think for what, I don't think it had like a massive, once again, like Dumbo didn't have like a massive budget because of the wartime, but I think that this one definitely pushes a lot of I think the backgrounds in Bambi are really beautiful looking back on it. Like, if you see the forest, it definitely feels lively. All the little creatures, they're definitely very memorable, like Thumper and Flower and Feline. It definitely, I would say that this movie is basically separated into two, and we have, young Bambi and older Bambi. I would say that this is the Lion King of the 40s.
Yeah, very similar, and definitely very similar aspects in both films for the most part.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, when I think about it, absolutely. I mean, we have a young animal, in this case for Bambi, a fawn. He's learning about the meadow, all the creatures around it. He sees all the obstacles around it, and his mom dies from an unfortunate circumstance. And then it cuts into him being an adult and learning about responsibility. And there's a fire. And then he becomes the prince of the forest. So yeah, basically take that into Simba, young lion cub learning about the circle of life, seeing all the struggles and troubles ahead. His father dies from an unfortunate circumstance. He grows up into a male lion, and he eventually has to take his responsibility, and he fights off against his uncle. There's a fire, and then eventually he becomes the king of Pride Rock. The end.
Yeah.
But no, seriously. Yeah, I think that the first half is very innocent and cute enough, and then, towards when it reaches the middle, it becomes a lot more dramatic with the winter scenes, and of course when Bambi's mom gets shot, and it's definitely one of the saddest moments in any movie or TV show you will ever see. And then it becomes incredibly dramatic when Bambi fights against Rano, and then it starts becoming very lighthearted when he reunites with Feline. And then, of course, when the fire happens and he and his father try to escape from the forest, and then everything becomes back to normal again with Bambi becoming the prince of the forest. I think that, again, I think that, similar to the other movies, I really do respect it. I think that it's a really nice coming of age story. It's pretty simple and to the point. There's not a villain in this movie. They could have easily made maybe one of the men like the villain, but man is always mysterious. You don't know what he's gonna plan. You don't know when he's gonna show up, and it's a lot of scary moments similar to the other Disney movies we were talking about. I remember this one scene in which a hunter comes by and he's around this part of the forest, and then there's these quails who are hiding away, and tells one of them to not fly, and then she panics and flies, and then she's shot dead. And then when Bambi is running away and he gets shot in his leg, and the prince of the forest tells him to get up while they run away from the fire, and then there's the fight with Rano. So yeah, similar to the other movies, it does play a lot into the emotions, in which there's a lot of happy moments and then there's a lot of sad and kind of frightening moments.
It's definitely one of the films that relies more heavily on introspection and symbolism than full-on characterization and story. Not that there aren't characters in this movie or a story in of itself, but it definitely tries to be one of the more deeper, shall we say, films, and especially even for its time, that's probably one of the main reasons why it was not successful in any way, and still probably to this day is still very underrated, even among the Golden Age films.
Yeah, it is true that, Bambi is considered a classic for a lot of people. It's not up there for some compared to Snow White, Pinocchio, or Fantasia. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Similar to the three movies we talked about previously, it didn't do well financially because of the war. But once again, a lot of people, when they saw the movie again, and it was vindicated as a classic. And yeah, it's definitely, once again, like all the other movies, it's definitely one of the most important because of all the risk that it took with both animation and, and storytelling. Sure, maybe the story is not as deep or the characters aren't as deep, but the message that is trying to say is actually pretty important. And I think that's why, for some people, they still call it as a classic. similar to Fantasia, Bambi did have a sequel, Bambi 2. Now, I've never seen this movie, and I'm kind of surprised that Disney never did a sequel based off of the second book, which is called Bambi's Children, which is focusing on Bambi and Feline's children. But, they basically made it into a midquel in which it focuses on Bambi's time during with his father after his mother died, and that's actually a pretty interesting idea to have as a second story following that. But I've never seen the movie, so I can't really say too much about it. Have you seen this movie?
No, I've not seen that film either. I must say.
All right, so unfortunately none of us have anything to say about that movie. So I'm sure if you have seen that movie, then please let us know in the comments below about what your thoughts are on it. I guess if you don't have anything else to say, I guess we can give our final word about what the golden era of Disney movies represent compared to all the others that came after.
Well, I think more than anything else, especially when you look at kind of the variety that these 5 movies have, the Golden Age to me really shows how Walt Disney himself really wanted to be an innovator in his craft. Almost every movie he proceeded to try to make, at least especially in this time period, he wanted to try something different, wanted to try something bigger, something that hadn't been done before, and was really trying to maybe not just leave his own personal mark, but demonstrate to others what type of, how far even the medium of animation could go. It really kind of was reflective of, that famous quote that he said that was used at the ending of Meet the Robinsons about how we keep moving forward and looking for new challenges. If anything, probably these 5 Golden Age films might be the biggest reflection of that philosophy.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when discussing about the movies during the Renaissance era, we did talk about how the message that those movies presented was more or less the same, but in a different perspective. But yeah, you're right. These 5 movies are completely different. One's based off of a fairy tale. One's based off of a book that's pretty dark. The third one is based off of classical music with, beautiful animation. The fourth one is, if I remember, somebody who was on Disney was reading a newspaper, and they found a newspaper article about an elephant who was born with big ears or something, and they decided to make a movie on that. And then the fifth one was based off of another book, but yeah, every single one of them were different. They all had different characters, they all had different morals and messages, and they all had different styles of animation. And if you look back from Snow White to Bambi, about how different the styles of animation were, and of course, because of the wartime, the Fantasia, Pinocchio, Fantasia, and Dumbo and Bambi didn't do well financially, but now they've been revindicated as classics. And it's definitely a really interesting piece of history about what Walt Disney Studios was doing during the limitations of World War II, and how they can be able to present those featurettes the way they wanted to. And I'm sure that maybe sometime in the future we'll talk about the other eras of Disney. But for now, all I have to say is that these 5 movies are definitely culturally significant. If any of you guys are interested in checking it out, if you've never seen them before, then please, I recommend that you do so. And I think that's all that we can say about this. So once again, Chris, thank you so much for coming on by.
Absolutely, anytime.
All right, so if you have anything to plug or self-promote, then do so.
Well, just that my two Christmas specials on both TV Trash and Rowdy and Friends are looking to wrap up production within the next few days. I'll try to get them out for my Patreon sponsors, hopefully by within the next few days. The TV Trash will hopefully be done in the next couple of days.
All right, that's fantastic. All right, guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Casual Chats. Let us know in the comments below about which of the 5 movies during the golden era of Disney did you watch first? Which is your favorite? Which is your least favorite? So, hope to see you around soon, and thank you for listening.